Hello, folks, and welcome. We are going to give other folks another minute or so to join us, and then we are going to get started. If you have any questions or any comments or you want to share with us where you're visiting us from, joining us from in the chat, feel free to use the chat to do that. We're also going to use that for the Q&A, but we're going to give folks about 2 minutes and then we're going to get started. Music is a good idea. We're should be playing some like new jazz or yacht rock maybe in the background. Yacht rock is a is a genre. I'm realizing that initially I thought about kind of being a kid and listening to like 80s music and realized that there's like a new generation of young people on TikTok who vibe out and commentate on yacht rock. It's pretty funny. But that is going to be a really poor segue into getting started with what we're going to discuss today. So I want to welcome everyone. Those of you that are in the room joining us today. My name is Toni Morgan. I'm the Managing Director at the Center for Law, Innovation, and Creativity at Northeastern University School of Law in Boston, Massachusetts. I want to welcome you. For those who don't know, CLIC, which is the name of our center for short, is Northeastern's IP Tech Research Center. So we focus on intellectual property and technology law with an emphasis on privacy law. And this series is our IP Tech series, and we call it the New Digital Divide, with the idea that we're exploring the ways that big tech seemingly there seems to be an overreach in the way that technology companies, tech systems, and at least the belief in the way that tech functions, there seems to be an overreach happening, and we want to check that overreach. And rather than only talk about the access that people have or do not have to technology, we now want to expand the conversation, at least in this series, to the way that whether we want to have conversations about access to technology, technology is accessing us. And so what can we do about that? What needs to be done? What conversations or provocations can we raise to have discussions about this? And where do we go from here? And so I am pleased to welcome you to the second of 3 conversations around this topic. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Claudia Haupt, one of our faculty members at CLIC, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Toni. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Claudia Haupt. I'm an associate professor of law and political science here at Northeastern, and I am super excited that we get to hear from Dr. Joan Donavan today, who is the research director at the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And Dr. Donovan leads the field in examining internet and technology studies, online extremism, media manipulation, and disinformation campaigns. Prior to joining the Kennedy School, Joan was the research lead for Data and Society's Media Manipulation Initiative, which is where our paths crossed, where she led a large team of researchers studying efforts to manipulate socio-technical systems for political gain, which unfortunately is very up to date. She received her PhD in sociology and science studies from the University of California, San Diego, and was a postdoctoral fellow at UCLA, where she studied white supremacist use of DNA ancestry tests, social movements, and technology. Today, Joan will talk about the true cost of misinformation, producing moral and technical order in a time of pandemonium. Joan, great to have you here. Thank you.
Mute, Zoom bingo, got it. Be sure to check your Zoom squares for the rest of the presentation where I continuously forget how technology works. Thank you both to Claudia and Tony for the warm introduction, and very excited to talk to you all and get some advice and some pushback on this new research that I'm starting to explore around the true costs of misinformation. It is something that I've been thinking about for a couple of years now, right? Like, who pays the price for misinformation at scale, right? One of the things that we often have a lot of hand wringing about with social media companies is the question of scale, and how scale can sometimes be considered a public good and other times be a really potent way to deliver falsehoods and mistruths and to harm many more folks than you might be able to harm without access to social media technology. So I'm going to run through the presentation. I know we have 90 minutes, Tony, is that right, for the whole thing? So I'll probably take about 89 minutes with this presentation. I'm just kidding, everybody. Plenty of time for questions. I'm probably not going to be able to see too much in the chat while I'm plugging along here. So if there's a clarifying question, feel free to just pop your mic on and say, Joan, I got a question. Otherwise, I'll try to get through it in a way that will give ample time for Q&A, and then we can all talk about what we would have been having for lunch if we were doing this in office. So without further ado, I lead a pretty I don't know, they're a quirky team at Shorenstein Center, and this is not anything disparaging. It's just that they're one of these teams where everybody really excels at putting aside everything else in order to deal with media manipulation and disinformation as a kind of daily beat. And so we blend the methods of investigative journalism with sociology, anthropology, and science studies in order to do this work. And I want to acknowledge all of the folks on my team who've contributed to this thinking over the past couple of years, because without them, I would have been able to do just a tiny fraction of the stuff that I've been able to do with their help. So when we talk about media manipulation and disinformation campaigns, I just want to get us all on the same page here. So let me take a screen share here. Do desktop. We'll see if this works. How does that look? Looks good? Awesome. Okay, great. Sometimes it looks sideways. Sometimes it doesn't look the way it should look. So this is good. Off to a great start. So yeah, the true cost of misinformation, producing moral and technical order in a time of pandemonium. So when we talk about media manipulation, disinformation campaigns, I just want to get us on the same page in terms of definition. So when we talk about media, basic comms 101 definition, an artifact of communication. So if I talk about news organizations, that's what I'm talking about. When I talk about media, it's that really big, broad class of things that allow us to excavate them and put them in order and then make a bigger sense of them through the context in which they were made meaningful in the world. Manipulation, we talk about, as to change by artful or unfair means so as to serve one's purpose. have a new piece out that I had been wanting to write for at least a year on the history of media manipulation attempts. And it actually begins with activists on the left, the yes men, using the way that the internet was built, where you could register whatever domain name you wanted, so long as nobody else had registered it. And they figured out pretty early on that you could steal the legitimacy and the branding of the WTO, for instance, or George Bush, and pretend to be them online. And the media manipulation hoaxing of this group wasn't really intended to be um malicious, in the sense that they did really focus on what the grand reveal was going to be and what kind of conversation people were going to have once they figured out that this group of activist comedians had hoaxed a conference into believing that they were the WTO, and they've gone on to impersonate Nike, as well as uh, uh, um, Dow Chemical, and even the New York Times. There's several documentaries about them. But in terms of the history of media manipulation, of course, that goes back much, much further through propaganda studies and whatnot. But when I'm thinking about online media manipulation in particular, that's where I train my history, and that's why the word artful appears in our definition. And then when we talk about disinformation, we're talking about something a little different. The creation and distribution of intentionally false information for political ends. And the reason why this matters is that we are now seeing disinformation operations at scale. And the socio-technical systems that we've brought together, the infrastructure of the internet plus platform or social media companies built on top of them, has created and even in some instances incentivized the political use of these technologies to spread disinformation in ways that most of these companies did not anticipate and now are reckoning with. And kind of, we'll talk a bit about the slapdash policy that's come together since then, where, we're going into an election, and I don't even know if Facebook and Twitter know what their rules are and how to implement them. And so when we think about disinformation, though, there are people who do spend quite a bit of time thinking about strategic communication and how they can get their bits of information to rise to the top of the cacophony of signals online. The search engine optimization industry, for instance, couldn't exist if, for instance, Google wasn't manipulatable in some sense of the word. And so when we study disinformation, we often study tactics. As well as study media manipulation, we study the tactics of these groups and how they make their issues known, or how they foist narratives onto the public or onto journalists. I'd be remiss not to mention the fact that we are in the midst of a pandemic. I don't know if you've heard about it. It's affecting everybody's lives. It is creating a situation in which many of us who would be enjoying a much more pro-social life are now stuck at home, isolated. The word itself comes from pan and demos, meaning all of the people, widespread, and of course of diseases is implied in the etymology and the history of this word, which I think does describe to some degree what is going on. But I've become much more interested in describing this moment as pandemonium, which is again all, but demonium means evil spirit, evil divine power, inferior divine being, individual destiny. But the reason why I think it's important for us to think about pandemonium in this moment is because we could look at a situation like Zoom bombing and understand it differently if we understand it as being part of the pandemic experience and part of the context. So what happened? Schools started shutting down. There wasn't a very robust plan for how to continue to deliver educational services, but there was a business out there called Zoom. And Zoom had contracts with different organizations as well as different universities. And people were like, well, can we just do the classroom through Zoom? Let's just do that. But because of the way Zoom was designed and the policies that undergirded it, it wasn't really set up to be a classroom or a massified product. It was really a business to business product. So the first iterations of Zoom bombing that we see are mostly teenagers taking advantage of the fact that people have left the gates open and they're sharing links or they're looking up links online. People are sharing Zoom links on Twitter and not realizing that this might draw some trolls. It might draw some flies. And so some of the early versions of Zoom bombing were teenagers recording themselves like with their cell phone at the screen, and they'd go in and they'd say something outrageous. They might, try to do a screen share and put up pornography. And Zoom had to reckon with this moment of pandemonium. As well, though, as others realized that Zoom bombing was an effective attention grabbing technique, we did see, even over at Harvard Law School, a student show up to class cleaning their gun, right? And the students that were in that class were like, we were all afraid he might end up shooting himself during class. Right. And of course, the student says, well, it's my free speech. It's my house. I'm on my Zoom and I should be able to clean my gun wherever I want. As well, we saw vicious racists as well as misogynists and, homophobic and anti-trans people start to target groups of people online by saying, finding out where they're meeting, sharing those links, and then doing more targeted harassment. And so the moment of the pandemic, with widespread adoption of a technology that wasn't really shaped to fit its function, which was to provide education, really opened up a big opportunity for these kinds of more malicious actors to come in and really kind of take over in many instances. And so we issued a report called Space Invaders, the Network Terrain of Zoom Bombing, really to just mark a time in history where you had this broad public uptake and then a kind of what do we do? Because what's interesting about this case and what it reveals is that Zoom had to act quickly because they were going to lose market share. They were going to be replaced by other services that were designed for education and were designed to be much more privacy oriented than Zoom had ever been. So we know that then in times of pandemonium, technologies can change effectively what they do. But part of it has to do with needing to have a very pro-social and also market orientation where the incentive to change is also about the business plan. If Zoom hadn't been able to repair these vulnerabilities, then we wouldn't be having this meeting on Zoom. I can guarantee you that much. And I use that as an example to say in moments of pandemonium, which are very few and far between, Foucault might describe them as a epistemic rupture. We're in this kind of paradigm shift if you're into Kuhn. But in this moment where we're trying to reconfigure our social world and how it maps onto and works with the digital world, we're going to see all kinds of implications for different professions. And one of the things that I'm most interested in understanding is, well, how are other professions affected by widespread misinformation when companies are not able to wrangle or fix what it is that they're doing? So what do I talk about when I talk about moral and technical order? I did a postdoc at UCLA with Chris Kelty and Aaron Panofsky. This book by Chris Kelty called Two Bits: The Cultural Significance of Free Software is a important text to me from the science and technology studies world, because he really lays out the way in which free software isn't necessarily about the price of the software. It's about the community of people that are brought together to work on a technology in a kind of bricolage or brick by brick manner. So in this book, he writes, geeks fashion together both technology, which is principally software, hardware, networks, and protocols, with an imagination of the proper order of collective political and commercial action. That is, of how economy and society should be ordered collectively. Right? So it's not just that technologists are building technology and thinking, this is cool, right? That's not the end game here. The end game here is actually to fashion a technology that reflects both your commercial interests, but also your political values. And that is thoroughly one of the animating features of why we get the kind of social media that we have currently. And so when I think about producing moral and technical order related to social media, I wrote this report at Data and Society with Tony Nadler and Matt Crane about this digital influence machine, which is the infrastructure of data collection and targeting capacities developed by ad platforms, web publishers, and other intermediaries, which includes consumer monitoring, audience targeting, and automated technologies that enhance its reach and ultimately its power to influence. And so if we reconceptualize the way in which we think about social media, not necessarily for the people to people bond that it brings together, but for the way in which it collects information about people and then sells parcels of data related to people's identities to political parties, to other advertisers that are trying to push a product, to even malicious actors that are seeking to gain influence over us and over society. We actually have to reimagine, well, what is the moral and technical order that underpins a system that looks like this, right? If the technical order is to build a digital influence machine, and Siva Varadarathyan writes a lot about this in his book, Anti-Social Media, then what is the morals that are underpinning it? And so when I'm thinking about that, I'm drawn to two recent and instructive quotes from Zuckerberg and then from Facebook. First, when we ask the question, who pays for social media, everybody here knows the adage, you know, when the product is free, the product is you, right? Okay, cool. But also, right, there's a huge industry undergirding Facebook, advertising industry, that is ensuring that Facebook is able to siphon millions and millions of dollars in advertising revenue out of the web and to surround different posts and content that is pretty much generated by uh, the audience. And so that structure has to be protected in some way by a set of principles. And so Zuckerberg said famously in October 2019, I don't think it's right for a private company to censor politicians in a democracy. And I think I agree with that. I don't think it's right for private companies to censor politicians in a democracy. That's terrible. But also, do I think it's right that you have built a technology that allows politicians to, at will and for a little bit of money, reach millions upon millions of people in targeted ways with falsehoods? Well, that changes our orientation to the statement, which is to say that if your private company's business is the amplification of information and the selling of information as advertising, that changes the calculus, because we're not really talking about free speech. We're talking about pay to play speech. We're talking about advertising. And we're also talking about politicians who are leveraging the power of social media to circumvent other kinds of gatekeepers and to delude publics. So Facebook in 2020 changed their policy and declared this: in the absence of regulation, Facebook and other companies are left to design their own policies. We have based ours on the principle that people should be able to hear from those who wish to lead them, warts and all. Right? And that statement of warts and all makes me think that they probably understand on some level that politicians are using their technology for antisocial means, while at the same time they're refusing to create a policy that would de-incentivize that kind of strategic misinformation on their platform. And it reminds me in a weird way of Section 230 as a mechanism, not necessarily as what some argue as a way to promote content moderation, but thinking about regulation around that time related to the web as regulation to decontrol an entire industry. That is to take away any of the burdens of broadcast, which include public interest obligations, and to stay, with this policy, we are going to allow you to grow as companies into whatever your final form will be, warts and all, right? And we've reached this point now where social media companies are primary drivers of information. They are primary places where people get their news, but they were actually never designed to be news delivery systems. Just like Zoom was never designed to be an educational tool. And as a result, they're haphazardly trying to retrofit their technology to deliver news, as well as, in the case of public health, critical health advisories. And we're seeing how the design of social media fails us in terms of delivering timely, local, relevant, and even authoritative information. So with all that in mind, then, one of the things that my team has really tried to do is to think about how to study this, how to study media manipulation, so that we can then get at some of the bigger picture questions about how does misinformation impact society. So we have a new research platform called the Media Manipulation Casebook at mediamanipulation.org. And one of the major features of this website is our theory methods package. So we have a theory of the life cycle model of media manipulation, and then we also have a stunning research document written by Brian Friedberg about investigative digital ethnography. And our code book was put together by Gabrielle Lim and includes ways of writing case studies so that we can get at the patterns at work. Because right now, most of its experience, just so much media manipulation documentation, right? There's so many journalists that are covering it. But we don't have a theory of how it all ties together. We just know that it happens every day. And so for us, when we're mapping a media manipulation campaign, we look for 5 points of action. We look at where is the campaign planned, or what are its origins? How is it seeded across the web and social platforms? What were the responses? This is really the make or break moment for different media manipulation campaigns, which is who responds: industry, activists, politicians, journalists. In some instances, we only become aware of a media manipulation attempt because somebody newsworthy has started to tweet about it, or somebody newsworthy is making a comment about it, and then journalists will sometimes cover that response. Then we look at mitigation attempts, right? Who is responsible for dampening the spread of misinformation? Platform companies have put together several tools that they're using, including, the ban hammer, as well as de-indexing. And then we also look at more other kinds of mitigation attempts like journalist debunking, for instance. And then lastly, we look at adjustments by manipulators to the new information environment. That is, if a media manipulation campaign is thwarted, we generally see those same actors try to do it again or differently. You can see that happening over and over and over again over the last few months with conspiracies about Hunter Biden. They have successfully so muddied the waters around Hunter Biden that you can almost believe you can't believe everything. So most people are just tuning out because there's so many different scandals and so many different possibilities. And even over the weekend, there was another video that was published purported to have him in compromising positions. And as a result, it's just become a really messy disinformation campaign. But importantly, when the campaign pivoted, because for months over the summer, they couldn't get anybody to really cover the Hunter Biden story. It couldn't break out of right-wing echo chambers. And so they had to adapt and change their tactics. And by getting the New York Post to pick up the story, platform companies decided that they weren't going to share the link as prominently as they share other things. And as well, mainstream media outlets just refused to cover it entirely. And so the tactics that worked in 2016 around hack and leak operations just don't have the same kind of import as they did back then. So with that in mind, I want to describe then who pays for misinformation. I, on the 15th, was part of this select committee on intelligence hearing related to misinformation and conspiracy theories. Happy to give people the link if you like to be bored out of your brain. But I found the hearing really important, I think, to get on the record that it's not a game. It's no longer, babies grown older. It's no longer cute, right? And for a while, these shenanigans around misinformation, disinformation, just like some of the shenanigans around Zoom bombing were kind of funny, kind of outrageous. But now when it comes to these tactics, they've actually themselves become business models and they've become ways of doing things in the world. And so when I ask the question, who pays for misinformation, I'm thinking about four key areas: journalists who have to write stories and then debunk those stories. And this causes immense waste in journalism because those journalists that have had to develop this misinformation beat could be doing other things. Public health professionals. I have doctors calling me day in and day out wanting to know how to go viral because they want people to know how important it is to wear masks and how important it is to remain distanced. And at this stage where everybody is exhausted by the pandemic and we're seeing a third wave, they want people to know that they can do things to better protect themselves and their loved ones. Third, civil society leaders. So now we have an entire set of folks that do, race issues, racial justice issues, immigration issues, groups that fight against the rising tide of white supremacy. They have all had to adapt and create positions within their organization to deal with misinformation related to their issue areas. Even Get Out the Vote campaign folks, whose job it is basically to tell you when and how to vote in your area have now had to become adept at combating misinformation. Again, this is a big waste of resources because misinformation at scale is different from just any old misinformation that we might have dealt with before social media. And then lastly, law enforcement, which is to say that very recently we've seen several instances where law enforcement have had to tweet as well as post to Facebook and to get out through other channels that people need to stop calling in rumors, that it's wasting time, it's wasting departmental resources, especially during the California wildfires. There was a rumor going around that was supported by some junk news websites saying that Antifa was lighting the fires, and people were refusing to leave their houses because they thought Antifa might come to their house and loot and burglarize. And so this is becoming a problem for law enforcement and first responders who have to deal with the task of cleaning up misinformation. And I'm talking about misinformation at scale, right? It's different. More is different, right? It's not the case that we're dealing with something very localized. We're dealing with something that has spread much further and much farther and penetrated more audiences than other campaigns. So let me just go run through 4 case studies from the casebook just so that you have a sense of what the flavor is there. When we're talking about how journalists are impacted by media manipulation campaigns and hoaxes, one of the ways in which they get hoaxed is by people putting together what we call evidence collages that seem to tell the whole story. And journalists then can try to verify pieces of it. Usually these evidence collages contain a kernel of truth. In this case study, the evidence collage contained information pointing to the wrong, to misidentifying the person who used a car to murder people. And in the evidence collage, it was put together on an anonymous message board on 4chan. And even on 4chan, people were saying, I don't buy it. I don't think this is some lefty. I don't know. But what they did was they took that evidence collage where they had collected pictures of this young man in his punk rock t-shirts. They had collected posts from his Facebook where he's it seems to be celebrating Bernie Sanders, and they put that together with the image of the car attack, the license plate from that car, suggesting that this person owned that car because there was also a similar picture of a car on his Facebook page. And journalists, some of them took the bait early on because it's a moment of chaos and you want to know more about who committed the crime. But by and large, journalists very quickly retracted once James Fields was named as the suspect. However, there were other junk news operations and far right groups that were continuing to push this false identification. Secondly, public health professionals. So the tactic of distributed amplification is an interesting one because we saw it probably most prominently for the first time in the attempt by Tom Cruise to remove his video of him jumping up and down on the couch, and he wanted that video gone off the internet, and anonymous, etc., downloaded it and just kept putting it back online, and it was just going to be impossible to remove it. A similar tactic was used to spread the Pandemic documentary. So the Pandemic as a meme was circulating amongst QAnon conspiracy theorists for months. It was this idea that the Democrats had come together and made a plan to take down Trump by bringing this pandemic to the shores of the US. Then that because that meme had done so well, this documentary called itself The Plandemic, and it featured a prominent anti-vax activist who's also a disgraced scientist. And they knew the content violated the terms of service on websites, especially on YouTube. So they made their own website, and they had an instruction kit on the website that said, download the video and re-upload it on your own personal accounts. And that happened several thousand times because they had planned to distribute it in this way, knowing full well that they were also going to get quite a bit of attention from the press. What was interesting, though, about this case study is that the Plandemic 2, or the second version of this documentary, did not have the same kind of success because platform companies were ready for the tactic. They were anticipating it, and they broke the links very quickly once this group had started to re-upload or to upload this new video. Civil society. We have a case study about Operation Blacksit, which was, according to the manipulators, an attempt to catfish an entire race. And it's a little known campaign. It's not to be confused with Candace Owens's right-wing organization, Blexit, which is Black Exit from the Democrat Party. In this style of attack, which we call the butterfly attack, groups of people pretend to be, or they mimic the patterns of behavior of different social groups so as to blend in. And then over time, they try to shift the messaging. So in Operation Blacksit, they were really trying to put on the map, as if it was coming from Black Lives Matter itself, this idea that Black people should exit the United States and return to Africa. Of course, this plays into Black nationalist wedge issues and the like, but this campaign was organized by a network of people who post on, at that time, they were posting and organizing on 4chan, and then they were deploying the tactic across Twitter. And they did this relatively unacknowledged, and it took a while for people to realize that this tactic was going to catch on. So we've seen very similar kinds of butterfly attacks from the Russian IRA group, where they pretended to be so many movements across different platforms. They pretended on Facebook to be pro-patriot groups, anti-patriot groups, pro-Muslim groups, anti-Muslim groups, pro-trans, anti-trans. And so that kind of style of attack, where you pretend to be the opposition and then try to nudge the opposition in a certain direction, is something that we see happen over and over and over again as part of the media manipulation toolkit. And then lastly, law enforcement. So what happens when a crime occurs is that not just journalists go online, but or an event like a mass shooting, but officers and law enforcement also go online, and they start looking at any kinds of clues that they might have about the identification of someone. And they too are in a race against time, trying to assess if there were if there was information out there and posted that they need access to, because platform companies are going to take it down once a person is identified. And so officers are often in the same mix as journalists and the general public in searching for information in moments of breaking news. When it comes to misidentifying the Parkland shooter, there were several attempts that morning to hitch Nicholas Cruz's name to different campaigns, one of which they misidentified him as a member of a militia called the Republic of Florida Militia. That was untrue. And then another attempt to make it seem like he was some kind of leftist who was trying to prove a point. Misidentification during breaking news events is a favored tactic, again, of groups who are trying to leave people with a certain impression about different political groups. And we see often right-wing extremists using these tactics, trying to lay the blame on either leftists or Antifa in order to salvage whatever kind of optics they might have left. And so that's a flavor of what we're researching over at the Technology and Social Change Research Project. And for me, I just want to close by saying there are many things that can be done about this. There is nothing inevitable about technology. There's nothing inevitable about social media. There is democracy without Facebook, of course. And one of the ways I've started to think about policy in that case is to think with the history of regulation around secondhand smoke. Now, it's not the case that we got regulation about public space and smoking because of the fact that cigarettes were harming certain people's health. That was considered an individual choice. But with secondhand smoke, there was an entire industry of people who that developed to say, yeah, secondhand smoke is a harm to public health. Secondhand smoke is actually causing people to lose time at work. It gets more expensive to build a building when you have to increase ventilation. Insurance companies have to deal with the effects of lung cancer and other kinds of disease that happen as a result of smoking. And so there had to be a groundswell of different professions and different impact zones for secondhand smoke to become an issue worthy of law and regulation and policy. So I wrote in this MIT Tech Review piece, like secondhand smoke, misinformation damages the quality of public life. Every conspiracy theory, every propaganda or disinformation campaign affects people. And the expense of not responding can grow exponentially over time. Since the 2016 US election, newsrooms, technology companies, civil society organizations, politicians, and educators and researchers have been working to quarantine the viral spread of misinformation. The true costs have been passed on to them and to the everyday folks who rely on social media to get news and information. So with that, thank you so much for listening to me. And here's a live shot of my team. So, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Joan. I'm gonna put my reaction, my clap reaction there in the screen. That was fantastic. I want to open the floor to anyone that has any questions and encourage you to get on the mic or get on the camera and ask your questions. And if you feel shy, feel free to then put your questions in the chat and we can ask them for you. But I'm going to turn it over to the room. Oh, and I should say, if you do have a question and there seems to be a queue, please use the hand raise function, though I don't imagine that we're going to need it. But if there is a queue and you hear someone speaking, please use the hand raise function and we'll get to you. So I see Woody and then Claudia.
Hi, Joan, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. I've been a huge fan of your work for quite some time, and to have you join us is really great. I also wanted to say that I really enjoyed the Dungeons and Dragons. Can I put a shout out for the Dungeons and Dragons?
Yeah, the misinfographics.
Yes, the
Yeah.
misinfographics. That has been one of the most wonderful things that I've seen come out in a while. So if we can, I'll put it in the chat afterwards or something, but I just wanted to call everyone's attention to that as something that was both very useful and something that I found delightful in sort of a weird way. So my question is actually, thank you very much for your comments on policy at the end and how the law should respond to this kind of disinformation. One of the questions I had is I've tried to think in some of my own research about how to create rules that would encourage different designs about these media. How do we In your mind, are there any design decisions, so not moderation decisions, but literally changing the user interface, for example, that would be useful here? Or is the problem significantly more complicated than merely the way in which these social media are architected?
Yeah, it's a good question. And like, so from my perspective, it's like this. When I think about the policy question, I think about, you know, let's think with a different technology. But so the first few folks to build airplanes, right, or flying machines, didn't start by building airports, right? And they didn't start by saying, we're going to need the TSA. We're going to need, these, like, we're going to need these mini malls, to be inside these airports. They were just like, we're going to build this crazy thing. And if it kills us, okay. Right. And at this point, though, we're like at the phase where somebody's building a Boeing, 737. I don't even know how big that is, but they're building a really big plane and they don't know how to land it. They don't know what the effects are going to be. They're just like, I can make this bigger. I can make this bigger. And the profits get bigger every time. And so I think you have to think about the whole system before you start to tweak around the edges of the system. I think that there's something inherently very flawed with the targeting around advertising, especially because we're not, like, people who are anonymous online have a limited amount of reach and have a limited amount of impact. It's the political elites that are benefiting the most. So when Facebook says, we're not going to touch politicians, what they're really saying is we're going to let them do whatever they want to do. And if it's bad for society, it's not on us. They were the ones who posted it, right? Our tool works the same no matter what. And so I don't know if tweaking the technology is as useful as thinking about, well, how do we make this work for certain industries better? And how do we ensure that there is a way for public health professionals to blast through the noise? I wrote a piece very early on for MIT Tech Review that was like, basically, you have advertising software that targets people. Why are you not using that to tell people how to get tested for COVID? Right? Why are you not deploying these technologies that are really fine-grained at getting at people's interests and things at more pro-social means, especially during a pandemic? I think the pandemic kind of revealed everything that we were talking about as researchers for a long time. But ultimately, when it comes to the tweaks to things, I think one of the things we have to really take seriously is how do we uninvent social media in terms of introducing competition, making data portable so that it's not such a loss to say, well, I want to try this new social network, but everything I've ever my posting history is on Facebook and my networks are there, right? We have to lower the cost of transitioning between different technological communication services. We have to stop Facebook from buying up things and then squashing them. Um, and, and we also have to put rules on public figures that they should actually have a higher bar because they reach more people than a lower bar. You and I have less rights on social media than a politician at this stage. That doesn't make any sense in terms of how they should be governing these systems. But part of it is the system itself is broke, which is they've allowed for the scaling of advertising without any oversight. And because there's no rules about oversight, they're able to make whatever rules they want to make. And then accountability, though, is nowhere. The last thing I'll mention is that increasing transparency is something that we need to do on the grounds of civil rights violations. That is not necessarily a political question. That is about you know, when you are looking up job ads on Facebook and they're only being served to people of a certain age, in certain zip codes, who have a certain style or attitude, right? Because they've really trained the algorithm on getting at young white people. That is a civil rights violation when they're training the algorithm to get, you know, to allow you to target advertising for apartments. This is where we need to be going in terms of transparency. But you know, they really, if you ask for transparency, they're like, oh, we'll give you political ads, and then they don't even give you all of them. You know, but we need transparency around the civil rights violations. And so those are the kinds of tweaks that I'm thinking about that aren't actually about product or service delivery, but are about many of the social problems caused by this technology.
That's very helpful. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Next we have Claudia, then Alex, Dario, and then John.
Thanks, Joan. That was excellent. So I'm very happy that you're pointing to the public health dimension. I mean, I think that's exactly right. Right, like this whole pandemic thing, all of a sudden brings things out that we've sort of been thinking about, and all of a sudden it's just really stark there for everyone to see. And so, in addition to the sort of pushing misinformation story, I was wondering if you could talk a little more about where the costs fall for just bad, basically bad public health advice. So that's something that I've started to think about in a little more detail, because sort of from my universe, the First Amendment kind of assumes that we have to protect the doctor-patient relationship, but then everything else is just like, you're on your own. But that also
Yeah.
assumes you have actually access to a doctor-patient relationship, right? And so that seems problematic. So if you could just unpack that a little more, that'd be great.
Yeah, so we have a paper that's under review right now for the WHO, which is a kind of policy paper for them, where we look at this, you know, how in this interim period, like how are public health professionals supposed to try to mitigate the impacts of misinformation? If you think about the reach of a conspiracy narrative like pandemic, right? This is showing up literally in the doctor's office as people say, you know, I had a doctor, I was talking to them and they were like, listen, one of my patients came in and said, they're not taking a vaccine. And I said to them, well, what do you mean we don't have a vaccine to give you? And they were like, well, the vaccine's going to have microchip and I don't want it. And so that's that. Right. And like, it's just like, oh, like people are taking this to heart and then are making decisions even before we have treatments as well. We saw this play out with the hydroxychloroquine example. I knew that was a charade from the minute it hit the world. I was watching Tucker Carlson, as you do when you research this field, and he's like my shit filter, right? I watch him and then I kind of know what of all of the conspiracy and crazy online is trading up the chain and getting into much more public places. And so there were these two Bitcoin entrepreneurs that had been retweeted by Elon Musk the day before, basically saying hydroxychloroquine is the greatest thing ever invented. We have a scientific paper, it was literally a Google Doc, where they had slapped a bunch of doctors' names on it. There was a bunch of like, just like it was like, it was just jargon. But one of those researchers, quote unquote, ends up on Tucker Carlson saying hydroxychloroquine is the biggest miracle drug of all time. It's a cure for coronavirus. Instantly online, we see a spike in people searching for chloroquine and tonic water because that's the result that you get. And they're trying to find supplements. They're trying to game the system by feeling as if they've been told something that nobody else has told them, and this is what they should do. The next day, of course, Trump comes out and says, well, you know, we're looking into hydroxychloroquine. The cure might have been here all along. I've got a good feeling about this. And then, you know, someone in the Pacific Southwest eats fish food because they think it's got hydroxy, or they see it's got chloroquine in it, and they die. Right. And so those are the kinds of ways in which bad health information travels through our media ecosystem and arrives on people's doorsteps. And so when I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking about, you know, the history of public health, I went back, and one of my research assistants, Jen Nielsen, was looking at the early you know, journal articles from public health professionals and doctors about the adoption of the internet. And there's this one quote that just stands out where this doctor says the internet is going to be terrible for medicine. And it's because of the fact that the gatekeepers are lost, and it's the way in which people are going to get health advice is going to be basically because the information has been failed to be monetized in every other way. So it's freely available on Google, and it's going to lead to a lot of problems. And so in this stage, when we talk about the cost to public health, it's not just that we're dealing with the old web where people are getting some bad advice, but it's manageable, or even the anti-vax movement, the way they were able to grow online and invite people in. Doctors have had to generate strategies to hedge against that. But now you're dealing with an administration, like a political administration, that benefits from downplaying the risks of this pandemic. Because it's an election year, and because it's you know, bad for business. And platform companies are reckoning with the fact that most people are getting their information through those networks. And so what you search for, what the returns are, matters immensely for the decisions you make later that day. The last thing I'll say is that it's looking more and more like the US is probably one of the last nations on earth to still be polarized on the mask issue. And this is having significant impact on capacity to reopen certain, not just stores and industries, but in the way in which our children are going to be sort of missing a year of education and sociality. And so even the kinds of things that would help people get back to a new normal are not allowed because of the polarization and the misinformation just being louder and more upfront and more divisive than science or truth.
Thank you.
Hi, Joan. This is Alex Engler. I'm a big fan of your work, and I especially appreciated your secondhand smoke analogy today. That was, I thought, a really valuable one. I wanted to ask about interventions, and specifically government interventions. This debate is getting a little more in the weeds. We've seen specific calls for utility style regulation, sort of direct, regulatory responses, as well as duty of care or systemic duty of care interventions that maybe had pointed to the UK public harms paper. I'm wondering, with disinformation specifically, is there something that jumps out to you as specifically likely to be effective or less? I'm just wondering if you have a strong opinion on what, and maybe this matters in a Biden administration, right? You can conceive of something happening. Thanks.
Yeah. No, this is, I think what you're seeing over the last 2 weeks is really important, because I think the tides are turning in terms of platform companies realizing that Trump is running out of time to do anything significantly to impact them. I think everybody's anticipating a kind of change in systems that are going to allow, in our political system, that are going to allow platforms to govern themselves in different ways. And when I think about how to handle disinformation, disinformation isn't necessarily a content problem. It's a problem of scale. And so you can have instances where people are massively deluded and say all kinds of kooky things. And but what you can't do is allow that to reach many, many millions of people day after day, repetitively, so that they start to think that's the only thing going on. And so when we think about disinformation less as a problem of content and I'll use the term free speech, because if I say free speech, I think the lawyers show up, they start running. So, but the free speech becomes less of an issue if we're talking about amplification. Now, one of the other metaphors that I like to think about when I talk about social media is they're kind of like a boombox, which is you put the tape in, you hit play, and then they really decide how loud the volume's going to get. They decide who's going to hear it and who's not. And rather than think about the distribution as something that's like imminently in the control of the content creator, we actually have to realize that distribution is in the hands of the platform company. These, if you'll allow me one other metaphor, these platforms are essentially empty warehouses, and you put the content on the shelves, right? And so by and large, they can decide, yeah, we're not going to serve that kind of content. We're not going to play in, for instance, there's a very bright line about child pornography that nobody is making the case that you should be able to get it whenever you want it. But at the same time, we have to have very similar rules about hate speech, incitement to violence, network harassment. And when it comes to disinformation at scale, we're only now starting to realize what that means for a society, which is to say that if QAnon groups are allowed to grow and grow and grow and grow, and nothing is done, and then they decide that through their networks, they're going to shuttle around massive amounts of medical misinformation to the tune of, potentially harming people's lives. Platform companies have to realize that the only reason why those groups were allowed to grow is because they didn't think about the power, the networking power that they were generating, and then how that was going to be turned into a kind of political opportunity. Over time, I think platform companies are probably going to put some kinds of stopgap measures in to prevent the spread of disinformation. We saw with the New York Post article, Twitter just deciding to break the links and not let you click through. And then they started banning accounts that were posting screenshots and were trying to route your information around, like route around the link ban. And there was a lot of right-wing pushback for that kind of moderation on the New York Post. And so I think it's going to be some time before we settle into kind of like, here's our policy and here's how we're going to enforce it. And we're going to know how to enforce it because we're going to have built tools that actually do the thing we say they're going to do. But in terms of government policy, when Biden, if there is a transition, well, first off, let me say, if Trump stays, I don't think he touches Section 230 because it just benefits him, right? It's, that's just how it works, is that if you're willing to use disinformation as a political tactic, you win, in terms of that, in terms of spreading, your narrative unabated. if Biden comes in, I don't think he touches 230 either, but I do think that platform companies will change their products in order to not be so hammered reputationally by everybody thinking they're just full of fake news, white supremacists, and Russian trolls, right? I mean, that's bad for business. So I think they are going to have to clean up in some ways. And the last thing I'll say is, if Twitter were to realize that it makes most of its money and most of its capital from journalists and journalist networks and providing access for the everyday folks to journalists, they could build a pretty awesome platform if they just were to say, we're going to serve journalism. Facebook probably needs to become a yard sale place, right? It just has never really been great at information and hasn't really thought a lot about like how to make sure that these groups and these event pages don't turn into safe havens for militias and whatnot. They've never really been able to handle this, but Facebook Marketplace does all right. So maybe, maybe work on that. Maybe like try to change the business model in a way that, serves the communities of people that are engaging with it. Yeah, so those are some of my thoughts on this, which is that I don't think we get out of this conundrum politically without some buy-in from these companies.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
So my question actually kind of flows from that, I think. So, I mean, what I keep hearing are we're looking at a lot of, societal problems, right? And I think depending in a lot of ways on societal solutions, writ large. So I guess what is the solution, if there is one, for, those of us who have family and friends who get sucked into these, misinformation, tropes. So how do we combat that while we're waiting for, a larger scale solution?
Yeah, it's really difficult. I, like all of you, have family members that, have bought into some of this, but I have an aunt that is a card carrying member of the NRA and was not a big gun owner. And now she's, in her late 60s and is a gun owner. I'm just hoping she doesn't hurt herself. But she had really, really got wrapped with the narrative that Antifa and the violent left were going to come, storm her tiny suburb, and that she needed to be prepared for that, right? And so I think that in instances where misinformation mobilizes, that is, it gets people to do things they wouldn't otherwise do, we have to engage with it differently, especially if it's some of these network conspiracy theories. The reason why QAnon really hits home for a lot of people is because, especially in the last couple of months. So prior to that, it was more about deep state, Trump's working with Mueller. They're both going to arrest Hillary Clinton. It's going to be awesome, right? So there's a lot of palace intrigue. But as platform companies decided that they were going to crack down on it, they started to blend into other groups, including Save the Children groups online, and started to recruit and are getting, quite a few moms involved in this conspiracy theory. And I think that, one of the questions I'll probably forever be chasing the answer to is how do a group of people come to believe that the most important thing they can do during a pandemic is go outside and protest child trafficking, right, in public with a bunch of other people, right? Why does that become their top issue? And part of it is because many of us have had to suffer the pains of abuse or know someone who has. And as adults, it really taps into our desire to protect children. I mean, we all want children to be safe and homed and warm and fed. And so this kind of conspiracy theory that evolves online and really starts to bring people into it, and you can spend hours a day looking at celebrities' Instagram accounts, looking for little instances where they mention pizza or post pizza emojis, because that's code for child pornography, cheese pizza, CP, child pornography, right? And you can spend all day looking for those clues and talking to other people in these communities about Hollywood and corrupt politicians. And that starts to feel really good. It starts to feel like you belong to something. It starts to feel like you're doing something bigger than you could do on your own. And that's the appeal. So for people, if you're dealing with people that are talking about these issues, the point isn't to play into the conspiracy and get them to tell you all about it, but really you might want to try to get at what's animating them. What is the important piece of this to them personally? And you will find, if you treat people with that you care about with dignity and compassion, and don't start off with immediately anyway, but eventually get to this is all BS. But, don't start off right away with that. I think you can have some success. Otherwise, just ban the conversation from, like you say, I have boundaries, my boundary is this, and I'm not going to talk to you about that. And if you can't talk about anything else, then what's up? Like that's a problem too. And so, yeah, it's a really difficult question when you have conspiracy at scale, because this is impacting way more people. And by virtue of you being able to turn to a bunch of other people, it has all the hallmarks of a kind of confirmation bias, where you can say, well, my family doesn't believe, but, all of these other people I know do. So who must be right,
So we had a final question. Oh, actually, I see Woody's hand up again. I didn't mean to say it again that way. Woody, we're just going to turn to you. I know that we had a question in the chat, but unfortunately that person has left. So if anyone else has a question, please raise your hand or put the question in the chat. And then with that, I'll turn it over to Woody.
Thank you so much. That, Joan, your final answer made me think a little bit about, in some of my own research, I'm researching gullibility. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about whether people are studying how gullible we are is affected by whether we're presented with information in isolation, or because the group aspect of this and the feeling of sort of that you're all in this together and the confirmation bias seems to me to work maybe differently than if you were just, if this was a little more isolated event. I don't know. I mean, I'm getting conflicting studies on how gullible people actually are. And I didn't know if there was a consensus and how this plays into your research.
Yeah, I mean, Alice Marwick has some research on like, why do people share fake news? And part of it is, people don't believe it and they're just trolling. They just want to upset, someone else in their timeline, or they think it's funny. So, lots of sharing of Hillary Clinton as, spirit cooking and as, a closet Satanist, etc. That kind of fake news sharing that is both sensational and outrageous. Sometimes it's just for a laugh. And the ways that we would typically get at questions like this are hard, in the sense that people don't like to admit that they've been tricked. But I've actually been, really impressed with the reporting of Donny O'Sullivan at CNN, where he's been going to some of these Trump rallies and just asking people about things that they've seen, and they'll say, you know, well, I saw this one video of Biden and he fell asleep, and then when confronted with, well, actually that didn't happen, that was a cheap fake, this is, you know, then they're just like, oh yeah, still funny. Right. And so, like, how do you get at that, right, when people don't necessarily value the kind of truths that maybe we do? And this is where the trouble with the trouble that news is in right now could not bode worse for democracy, in the sense that this disinformation is meant to trick you. It's meant to be slick. It's meant to be packaged in ways that um, clue into all of the context that humans usually make to make a decision about things. Like, they'll spoof a URL, they'll make the website look really good. It'll look as if you're on a news website. It's called the Denver Daily, but you don't live in Denver, so you don't know that that's not a paper, right? And so you just are like, oh, this must have happened. And so, on the one hand, it's meant to trick you. And then on the second part, which is different from the yes men who really play on the reveal in order to talk about something, to talk about a bigger social critique, there is no reveal here. There's no man behind the curtain. It's just kind of like, on to the next disinformation campaign. Right. And so I think in some ways, if we want to get at these questions about if people are really gullible or if they're just trolling, you know, we also have to ask questions about how do they assess what's true. And the thing that social media has done over the years is really break down those contextual cues, really break down our capacity to know the difference between things. So, you know, you'll see a post about somebody's birthday party, post about somebody's dinner, post about the Epstein fiasco, post about the elections coming up, right? It all starts to feel very similar. And so as a result, it's not leading folks to you know, into a space where they have very much respect for truth, because it's all kind of just out there for them to discover. And so that's why I think, you know, if we were to really reorient this entire thing, if we're really to think about the internet in a whole new way, we would hire 10,000 librarians to start sorting out the curation problem. We would dispense with everyday folks being able to tag their own content and add their own metadata, because we know that that's how they're shoehorning their disinformation into the breaking news cycle, by tagging their content with things that are timely and relevant, even if that has nothing to do with their content. And I think, you know, you can kind of descale social media or uninvent social media if you put more public interest obligations on them to ensure that as a company they are delivering timely, local, relevant, and authoritative updates for folks that are clearly marked, so that when a pandemic hits, our communication systems aren't just eminently exploitable by anyone in all directions. And so that's my hope for this field of disinformation research, is that we use what we study as a vehicle for getting the web we want and getting at an information ecosystem that really serves the broadest public interest.
Thank you so much. Very well said. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
So I recognize that we have only 3 minutes. And I do see we have a hand up, but also have a question in the chat. So I'm going to put both questions out there. I'm going to invite Adnan to also get on the mic and ask your question. But first, I'll just phrase the question in the chat from Jasmine. So at the top of this the event, I mentioned that this conversation, or Joan, your talk is part of a larger question that we're asking at CLIC about what it means to live in an age where, whether or not we want to access technology, technology is accessing us. And so if I'm understanding Jasmine's question correctly, she's asking for your take or your position on how that is happening and what can be done to mitigate that. And I hope I've captured that accurately, Jasmine. And then I'll turn it over to Adnan to ask your question as well. And then those will be our final questions for this afternoon.
Hi, thank you, Tony and Joan, for the amazing talk. I'm going to make this super quick because I know it's 1:29 right now. I just want to know, in terms of your the work around the case studies and the framework, where you see that going. And I do note that you have non-Western case study examples within the I'll call it a database. But the reason why I think of it that way is, for me at least, it's super valuable to start kind of thinking of this over the course of time and how potentially some of these approaches and tactics and concerns are, and challenges are, shifting in this landscape. And so I'm wondering both, A, just generally where you see this work going, and B, in terms of the non-Western context, do you think that this framework will adapt well to that? Are there kind of considerations you've made to make sure that, whether it's India or Brazil, the way you think of these problems all kind of fit well together? Or are they learning from each other, just generally? Thank you.
Yeah, so the original project, when we first conceptualized it, was called the Global Media Manipulation Casebook, but we felt like that was actually kind of redundant in the sense that what we were aiming to do is build out a model theoretically that is instructive. So we use like a kind of data lifecycle model, which is to say that these are the points of the story that you want to tell, and part of it is about the origin of a campaign, and that can be anything from political elites to troll farms to just unhappy accidents. And so we do have a couple of case studies in there already from India. We also have a fellow, Jonathan Ong, who ran several significant ethnographies in the Philippines about troll farms and disinformation work. And so we are working with a few different researchers to get his case studies together, and as well as several others. So yeah, we're very excited about, over the next year and a half or so, 2 years, of trying to load the casebook up with over 100 different case studies. And so because we do see that the technological affordances, right, are the things that allow certain kinds of manipulation attacks to happen. But it also depends on the social context, right? What is acceptable in certain areas, what kind of behavior of politicians or other journalists is going to be acceptable, who is fighting who in terms of a battle over the information ecosystem writ large. And then also across countries, we have seen, especially in this moment, the US really trying to lay the blame for the pandemic on China, and the notion of, and pardon my language here, but the use of the term the China virus, and the mess up at the White House where someone called it Kung Flu. That comes straight from white supremacist networks that we were studying in at the beginning of the pandemic in January. And these groups were ringing the alarms, trying to get people to pay attention to what was going on in China. And they had all kinds of nicknames for it back then. And we can trace those lines, and we can make sense of that. And we can look at how things that might seem to be less important or minor incidents. What we want to do with Casebook is show how those minor incidents then create a long tail, and if they're effective, they start to show up in mainstream media and in the speech of political elites. And we do that also in our case study of Jobs Not Mobs, which is now a TV commercial, but it started several years ago with a Reddit post. And so, yeah, and then the question about technology, and I've perhaps read too much Latour, but he talks about technology as society made durable. And I do believe that the way in which we build our technology has a lot to do with how we think society should work. And in this instance, we have a set of technologies that were probably, I don't want to say well-intentioned, because Facebook really began as a kind of like rating system for women, and YouTube really began as a dating site, and Twitter really began as Slack. It was like a messaging service between, but they kind of backed into their users when they found social movements, and when social movements really showed what the possibilities of these platforms could be. But that first mover advantage is now gone. And so it's really important that we understand what we're dealing with now is different, because more is different. And when it comes to the digital divide, then we're arguing not necessarily just about access to the technology, but about how the technology should be built in order to serve communities. And when we see differential impacts of misinformation targeting Black and Brown communities, especially Latino voters right now, we have to do something to change it. And unfortunately, we don't have the right regulation and levers in place to actually make those things happen. So we just, scream at a wall. We just do everything we can to raise awareness. It's actually Disinformation Awareness Week. And so if you use the hashtag #DisruptDisinfo, there's a lot of great events happening. So with that, I got to go. New Zoom.
Thank you, Joan, and thank you everyone for the extra 5 minutes. It was a pleasure to just hear this, and we're going to share this recording and any of the resources that you've shared with anyone that was in the room and registered today. So thank you
so much. Tony, Claudia, appreciate all the work you put in. All right. Have a good one.
Great week, everyone.